I only needed shelter. But that old vat seemed to be waiting for me.
No apartment, no bakery, no winter coat worth trusting. Just a flour-stained canvas bag and $9 she had counted beneath a bus station light. And with that $9, she bought a condemned historic ostrich-plume dyer's shed on West 38th Street, New York County, New York. Erased from city trade maps, in 1957 half the roof had folded inward. Indigo black water seeped beneath the floorboards. The county had closed it on October 14, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. Yet beneath the false bottom of an oak indigo vat lay a sealed chamber, untouched for 65 years, holding money, a vanished color formula, and a message meant for the person who arrived with nothing. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Willa Mercer had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Yonkers, she measured sugar into chipped bowls, rain beneath the kitchen sill, and the distance between her parents' voices after dark. At 9, she could divide a recipe without paper. At 12, she knew burnt caramel could not be hidden by cinnamon. Her father, Daniel, repaired elevator motors until a cable accident left 2 fingers stiff. He opened jars with a leather strap and signed slowly. Damaged tools were not useless, he taught her. They required a different grip. The person who understood her best was her grandfather, Willa Mercer, a retired theatrical costumer above a notion shop near 10th Avenue. Every Saturday, he heated water in a dented copper kettle and showed her how old materials answered patience. He cleaned silk with soap flakes and restored feathers for forgotten stage hats. Willa tied ostrich plumes into loose bundles while he tested the bath with 2 fingers, never trusting the dial alone. After rinsing, he tapped each spine against the plaster, then drew a blunt knife beneath the flues until they curled like dark water under wind. At noon, they ate rye bread with apple butter beside the work table. Color tells the truth only after rinsing, Elias once said. She understood him to mean that heat, darkness, and waiting could alter a thing without destroying what it had been. He died during a wet march when Willa was 19. The landlord emptied his rooms before she returned from the funeral home. His copper kettle, curling knives, swatch cards, and scorched trade notebook went into an estate truck with broken chairs and office lamps. Willa recovered only 1 half-burned page from the gutter, its margin marked with ratios for iron, tannin, and root. 3 years later, Marin Vale entered Willa's bakery plans in a gray wool coat with immaculate nails and a voice that made disagreement feel impolite. She chose the bank, rewrote the partnership papers, and brought signatures after closing, when Willa's eyes were grainy from 14 hours of dough and invoices. Marin never shouted. She moved numbers, offered coffee, and touched each page with 1 red fingernail. Willa signed, believing exhaustion was the price of beginning. On November 7, 2022, 2 men from the lender sealed the bakery door with a steel bar while trays of unbaked cardamom rolls cooled inside. Marin had emptied the business account before dawn and left no forwarding address. The forged loan guarantees carried Willa's name in 6 places. Her mother stood under the striped awning, gripping Willa's apartment key between thumb and forefinger. When Willa asked whether she could sleep on the sofa, her mother looked toward the traffic and placed the key on top of a cardboard box. "You signed it, Willa. The debt is yours." 8 words. Then silence. Willa lifted the box containing 1 apron, 2 shirts, and Elias's burned page. The wind caught the bakery receipt, taped to its side, and worried it loose. Her mother watched it slide along the curb, but did not bend to retrieve it. For 6 weeks, Willa moved according to warmth. She slept upright in the Port Authority terminal until security recognized her coat. In Newark, she shared a church basement with women who kept shoes beneath their heads. In Jersey City, she slept behind a laundromat vent and woke with lint in her hair. Patterson offered one dry mill stairwell before rain entered the roof. Her money thinned exactly: $31 after the bakery, $24 after transit, $18 after soup and socks, $12 after antiseptic, then $9 after a roll she halved for morning. She kept the coins in a paper envelope and the bills folded around Elias's burned page. Each night, she checked both, not because $9 could protect her, but because counting was still a form of order. On the 42nd day, cold rain drove her into the main reading room of the New York Public Library. She sat beneath a green-shaded lamp until feeling returned to her fingertips. On a nearby cart lay a municipal auction circular, its pages printed too lightly. Between listings for boiler rooms and condemned storage lots, one line had been circled in blue pencil: Historic Plume Dyer Shed, Tax Lien Sale, Opening Bid, $9, Structure as is. The photograph showed a narrow brick and timber building pressed behind newer warehouses, its roof bowed like a tired shoulder. Willa read the address twice. 38th Street. 4 blocks from the rooms where Elias had once steamed feathers above a kettle. She copied the auction time onto the back of her bus receipt, wrapped the uneaten half-roll in paper, and walked toward the garment district before the library closed. By morning, the $9 would either disappear or become a door. Before dawn, Willa walked north through rain that had stiffened into sleet, carrying the canvas bag beneath her coat and keeping the library circular folded inside her shirt. The auction was not until Monday. She spent Friday night in a hay barn behind an abandoned riding stable near Little Falls, 7 miles from the Patterson stairwell where she had last slept. The loft smelled of dust, leather, and old animal heat. At 2:10 in the morning, the temperature reached 28 degrees. She tucked loose hay around her boots, but the cold entered through the soles and remained there. On Saturday, she walked 4 miles to the bus stop, spent $3.50 on a ride to Port Authority, and saved the rest by refusing coffee. The driver glanced twice at her damp coat before waving her aboard. Willa sat above the rear wheel, where the engine's vibration warmed one side of her body, and watched warehouses gather along the highway. Manhattan appeared without ceremony. By 9, delivery carts were rattling through the garment district. Willa passed Mendel's Button Exchange, Crown Pleating Company, the Blue Thimble Cafe, Harlow Sewing Machine Repair, and a narrow shop called Goldenberg Feathers, its windows papered from inside. Above them, faded lettering remained on brick walls where newer signs had failed to cover older trades. The auction took place in the office of the New York County Clerk, inside a room with marble floors and fluorescent lights that flattened every face. 12 people had come for tax liens, most carrying folders thick enough to suggest preparation. Willa stood at the rear with her $9 inside the paper envelope. The clerk at the registration desk wore silver spectacles attached to a black cord. Her nameplate read, Mrs. Evelyn Harrow. She looked at Willa's bag, then at the auction sheet. The plume shed? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Harrow removed her spectacles and cleaned them with the edge of a handkerchief. You understand, there is no electrical service? Yes, ma'am. You understand the water line was capped in 1961? Yes, ma'am. The rear foundation is below street grade and floods? Yes, ma'am. And the demolition order transfers with the deed? Yes, ma'am. The clerk returned her glasses to her face. You have inspected it? No, ma'am. A man 2 chairs away gave a quiet laugh. Mrs. Harrow did not look toward him. When the lot number was called, no one raised a hand. The auction officer read the legal description, waited 7 seconds, and asked for an opening bid. Willa held up the envelope. $9, she said. The brass stamp came down upon the deed with a sound like a small door closing. Mrs. Harrow counted the bills and coins twice, then slid the document beneath a blotter. "West 38th, she said. "Enter through the service passage east of 10th Avenue. The front address was sealed when the loading building went up. There is an iron gate beside a painted advertisement for sewing needles. If you reach the tunnel ramp, you've gone too far." She opened a drawer for change, remembered there was none, and looked again at the name on the deed. Mercer. Willa waited. Mrs. Harrow turned toward a wall of old index cabinets. She opened one drawer, ran a finger along the cards, and removed a yellowed record. "Elias Mercer," she said. "Costume dresser, feather worker. He was my grandfather." The clerk lowered the card. Her left thumb rested over a blue municipal seal. He came here in 1989 asking about that shed. Then again in 1994, he said the old dyer, Beatrice Voss, had promised him access to the workbooks if the city ever released the building. Willa looked at the card, but it could not make out the handwriting. Did he buy it? It was tied in probate, then taxes, then condemnation. The city preferred to forget it. Mrs. Harrow studied Willa's face. "He stopped coming. He died 4 years ago." The clerk placed the index card beside the deed. He always carried a copper kettle handle in his coat pocket. No kettle, just the handle. Willa had never known that. Mrs. Harrow copied the archive number onto a slip of paper and tucked it under the brass clip of the deed. Her voice softened, though her posture did not. Buildings do not recognize surnames, but sometimes records do. Outside, the sleet had become a thin rain. Willa walked west on 38th Street, past loading docks and men rolling bolts of fabric wrapped in plastic. The street narrowed near 10th Avenue, where elevated approaches cast long shadows over the service lanes. The painted sewing needle advertisement had faded to the color of old bone. Beside it stood an iron gate chained but not locked. A man in a green work jacket watched from the doorway of a lamp repair warehouse. His beard was white, except for a tobacco stain near the mouth. A black dog stood beside him, one ear folded. "You bought Voss's place," he said. Willa nodded. The dog approached, smelled her canvas bag, and returned to the man. "Name's Theo Bell. Dog's Bishop. He'll bark at rats and ignore thieves." Behind the warehouses, the passage opened into a forgotten service court where 2 black walnut trees had forced their roots beneath the pavement. Their bare limbs reached above the roofs, improbable and patient. At the far end stood the shed. It was larger than the auction photograph suggested, nearly 50 feet long and 22 feet wide, built of dark brick along the street side and timber framing at the rear. Tar paper hung from the roof in strips. A shallow brick chimney leaned 3 inches away from True, its upper courses furred with moss. Above the warped double doors, a tin sign retained 5 legible words: Voss Plume, Dyeing and Dressing. The lock had already rusted through. Willa pushed with her shoulder until the lower hinge tore from softened wood. Air left the building slowly. It smelled of vinegar, wet feathers, sulfur, and something metallic beneath them all. Her tongue caught the bitterness before she had crossed the threshold. When she touched the wall, brick dust came away on her fingertips like dried pigment. The front room held a long sorting table tilted toward the floor. Thousands of ostrich plumes lay in collapsed bundles beneath it, their colors muddied by damp. Violet gone brown, scarlet gone black, pale green reduced to the shade of pond water. When Willa lifted one, the shaft snapped without resistance. Rain ticked through the roof into zinc pans that had been placed there decades earlier. Some were full. Others had rusted open and dripped onto the floorboards below. Each step produced a different complaint: a high squeak near the table, a hollow knock beside the wall, and a deep, damp groan toward the back room. She found the workroom behind a hanging canvas curtain stiff with dye. There were 3 wooden vats, each wide enough for a person to crouch inside. 2 had split along their iron bands. The third, made from thick oak staves darkened almost blue, remained upright in the far corner. Its surface held 6 inches of black mud. Willa leaned over it. The odor was cold and mineral, unlike the sourness elsewhere. On the rim, someone had carved a row of small feather shapes. Beneath them, almost erased by wear, were the initials EM. She placed both hands on the oak and felt the chill pass into her palms. By dusk, she had chosen a dry section of floor beneath the sorting table. She spread discarded packing paper over the boards, folded her coat beneath her head, and ate the remaining half of the roll from Patterson. Somewhere behind the wall, Bishop barked once. Theo answered with a whistle. The city continued on every side of her, trucks braking, pipes knocking, rain moving through gutters. Yet inside the shed, the sounds arrived softened, as if they had traveled through cloth. Willa held the deed against her chest until sleep came. Brightness was not something one was born with. It was earned by steeping in the darkest water and keeping the color. At first light, Willa folded the packing paper, tied back her hair with baker's twine, and began learning which parts of the shed could still be trusted. The capped water line beneath the front sink gave nothing but a rusty cough. Theo showed her a hand pump well in the warehouse court, 43 paces from the door, and warned her to let each bucket settle before drinking. The outhouse stood behind a corrugated fence, its roof held down by 2 bricks and a broken tailor's iron. By the 3rd day, she knew the floor's language. The boards beside the chimney squealed but held. The center aisle groaned because joists had loosened. One plank near the Indigo Vat made no sound at all and bent beneath her heel. She marked unsafe places with chalk taken from the sorting table. On Tuesday afternoon, she followed West 38th Street to Grady Hardware, a narrow shop with galvanized buckets hanging from the ceiling, and the warm odor of rope, machine oil, and cut pine. Its owner, Solomon Grady, had a pale crescent scar across his upper lip that lifted whenever he pressed his mouth shut. Willa set a chimney brush, gloves, lamp oil, and a box of nails on the counter. "I can pay after I find work," she said. Solomon studied the cracked leather of her boots, then opened a ledger thick with taped repairs. "Name, Willa Mercer. Address?" She gave him the Plume shed. His pencil stopped. "That building owes half this neighborhood an apology. I only need it to stand." He wrote her name beneath the heading, House Accounts, and pushed the purchases toward her. 30 days. After that, you come tell me why. From beneath the counter, he added a stained paperback titled Repairs for the Patient Homeowner. The spine had been reinforced with electrical tape. "That one's free," he said. Author lies about plumbing, but the chimney chapter is honest. The prices were written in his square hand. A 6-inch wire chimney brush, $8.75. 20 feet of jointed fiberglass rod, $6.40. Leather gloves, $2.25. A quart of lamp oil, $1.10. Galvanized roofing nails, $1.85. He did not total them aloud. Willa began with the chimney because every other repair depended upon heat. She spread wet newspapers across the hearth and sealed the opening with an old flour sack, leaving one slit for the brush rod. From the roof, reached by a warehouse ladder Theo held steady, she removed 3 loose bricks and lowered the wire head through the flue. The first pull stopped after 4 feet. She twisted clockwise, lifted 6 inches, and drove it down again. Creosote fell inside, like black grain. For 5 hours, she worked the brush through hardened ridges, adding 1 rod at a time, then drawing them upward without reversing the joints. Her shoulders burned before noon. By 2, Soot had entered her sleeves and gathered in the corners of her mouth. The obstruction finally broke with a soft collapse, releasing a nest of twigs, cloth scraps, and a bird's desiccated wing into the sealed hearth. She repeated the passage until the brush moved freely from crown to firebox. Then she scraped the smoke shelf with a bent kitchen spatula and shoveled the creosote into a lidded dye pail. It weighed nearly 11 pounds. The first fire was no larger than 2 hands, cupped together. Willa warmed the flue with a twist of newspaper, watched the smoke hesitate, then rise. She added pine splinters, 1 broken chair rung, and finally, a length of dry walnut Theo had left outside the door. The draft held clean. No smoke entered the room. She heated well water in a small enamel pot borrowed from him and cooked oatmeal with salt. It was her first hot meal in 9 days. She ate seated on the floor, holding the bowl close enough for steam to touch her face. When the final spoonful was gone, she rinsed the pot carefully and drank the gray water. Only then did she begin the inventory. The back workroom yielded fewer useful things than its shadows had promised. There was a brass dye thermometer clouded but intact, its scale ending at 220 degrees, a bone-handled curling knife with no cutting edge, a rack of iron hooks shaped to hold bundled plumes, 2 stoneware crocks labeled madder and logwood, a copper rinse paddle green with corrosion, a hand-cranked extractor whose perforated drum had frozen in place, and a charred notebook fused along one side, several pages still bearing narrow columns of temperatures and minutes. She carried each object to the front table, brushed it clean, and recorded it on the reverse of the auction circular. The oak indigo vat remained where it had stood. Its iron bands were deeply rusted, but not loose. Willa measured the outside with Elias's habit of precision. 52 inches across, 38 inches high, oak staves nearly 2 inches thick. A vat that size that should have shifted when she pushed against the rim. It did not. She emptied the black mud with a zinc scoop, transferring it into the least damaged vat. The upper layer was watery and smelled faintly of ammonia. Beneath it lay dense blue sediment that pulled at the scoop like clay. After 3 hours, the bottom emerged, a circular floor of oak stained so dark that her lamp flame appeared yellow-green against it. Willa wrapped the boards with the handle of the curling knife. Near the edge, the sound was thick and final. At the center, it answered hollow. She struck it again, moving by inches, until the tone changed along a circle, roughly 14 inches wide. There was no visible seam. She pressed her weight onto it with both palms. The wood dipped slightly, then returned. A false bottom. The repair manual offered nothing for 19th century dye vats, so Willa worked from the object itself. She cleaned the surface with warm water and a stiff brush, following the grain. Under the indigo crust appeared 3 cedar plugs, each cut flush and stained to resemble oak knots. She softened them with steam from the enamel pot. The first lifted after 20 minutes. The second split and had to be removed with tweezers. Beneath the third, her awl touched metal. Willa inserted the blunt curling knife into the narrow gap and turned it sideways. A cedar disc rose no more than the width of a fingernail. She stopped. The room had grown dark while she worked. She trimmed the oil lamp, checked that the chimney fire had settled, and washed both hands before returning. Whatever had been sealed below had waited too long to be opened carelessly. Using 2 iron hooks as handles, she raised the disc. It was heavier than expected, lined beneath with a sheet of lead, and fitted so exactly that the indigo mud had never entered. Below it lay a dry cavity inside the vat's doubled base. The first package was wrapped in waxed sailcloth and tied with tarred cord. Willa lifted it onto the table, cut only the knot, and unfolded each layer rather than tearing it. Inside were 6 curling knives, their bone and walnut handles worn smooth by different hands. A pair of silver plume shears rested beside a small brass scale, 12 nesting weights, and a bundle of raw ostrich feathers protected between sheets of blue paper. The feathers were cream-colored and supple. The second package held 3 glass jars sealed with wax, powdered iron ore, dried madder root, and dark leaves labeled Indigo Vat. Between them lay a slim handbook bound in black calfskin. Its title, written by hand, read Permanent Lustrous Black, Root, Tannin, Iron, and Time. A small platinum ostrich feather had been fastened inside the cover. Willa touched it once, then withdrew her finger. At the bottom of the cavity stood a tin dispatch box with a carrying handle folded flat. Its lock had already been opened before burial. Inside, oilcloth packets had been stacked edgewise, each labeled by year. The first contained gold coins. She brought the box near the fire, spread a clean length of canvas over the table, and counted in groups of 10. There were Liberty Head, double eagles, Indian head eagles, British sovereigns, and French 20-franc roosters, each separated by circles of tissue. Several showed wear from ordinary use. Others retained sharp edges and fine lines beneath the dust. Willa counted once, then again. Then she converted the face values according to a penciled ledger stored beneath the packets. The total recorded there was $39,600. She did not calculate what collectors might pay. The written number was already too large to enter her thoughts cleanly. At the bottom of the box lay a purple heart in a dark presentation case, the reverse engraved Samuel Voss, 1944. A narrow envelope had been tucked beneath it. The paper was browned, but the seal remained whole. Across the front, in sloping black ink, someone had written, "My dear one, whoever you are." Willa carried the envelope outside without opening it. Rain had stopped. Water shone in the wagon ruts of the service court and trembled whenever trucks passed beyond the wall. Bishop slept beneath Theo's doorway, his folded ear moving at distant sounds. The walnut branches held drops that released one at a time. She sat on the well curb until the lamp inside the shed became a small amber square. The letter rested across her knees, sealed and quiet. She could bear the money, perhaps, by counting it. She could understand the tools by holding them. The handwriting required something else, and she had no strength left that night to discover what. Brightness was not something one was born with. It was earned by steeping in the darkest water and keeping the color. At sunrise, Willa carried the envelope inside and set it beside the cooling stove. When she lifted it toward the window, the sloping capitals became familiar. Elias had copied that same hand into the margins of his burned notebook, preserving measurements whose author he had never named. She warmed a knife above the lamp and eased it beneath the seal. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then you have already done the hardest work. You entered a room that smelled abandoned, put your hands into the old vat, and believed the hollow sound beneath the oak was worth answering. My name is Beatrice Augusta Voss. Dr. Miriam Katz of St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City diagnosed me with pulmonary fibrosis in February 1957. She told me the sulfur years had settled inside my lungs and that I should leave the city before another winter. I did not leave. There were accounts to close, tools to oil, and a promise to keep. Our trade began with Augusta Voss, born in Hamburg in 1848, who came to New York in 1871 and dyed mourning plumes on Baxter Street. Her daughter Clara, born in 1874, opened this shed in 1894. Clara's daughter Ruth, born above the workroom in 1898, carried our formulas through the shortages of the Great War. I, Ruth's daughter, was born here in 1919 and became the fourth pair of hands at the vats. My husband, Samuel Voss, was killed in France during the Second World War in August 1944. The metal in the box came home without him. Afterward, I worked beside my son Nathan until chemicals injured his eyes and he left for Ohio. On October 3, 1957, I closed Voss Plume Dyeing and Dressing. No plume has been properly dressed in this room since that date. More than 30 years may pass before anyone reads this. Perhaps longer. The black formula in the calfskin book is exact, but exactness is not haste. Soak the plumes in soap water at 110 degrees for 12 minutes. Rinse twice below 60 degrees. For every pound of feather, use 4 ounces of crushed gall and 1 ounce of madder root. Let the iron liquor cool before adding it. 1 part liquor to 8 parts dye bath. Keep the final bath between 145 and 150 degrees for 40 minutes. Never boil the shaft. Curl only when the feather is nearly dry, and draw the dull blade away from the hand. The money came from honest orders and years when customers paid in gold because banks frightened them. Spend what is required to keep the roof, chimney, floor, and windows from failing. Do not let the coins make decisions for you. Money sealed away becomes only metal. Work placed into another person's hands becomes inheritance. Behind the shed, the eastern walnut bears an iron feather driven into the bark 7 feet above the ground. Samuel placed it there before he shipped out. If the tree remains, leave the marker where it is. Some things should be found only when the right season exposes them. I do not know your name. I know only that you listen to the vat. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Beatrice Augusta, Voss, October 3rd, 1957. Willa read the letter once beside the window, and again at the sorting table. The second time, she heard Elias's pauses between the measurements. She folded the pages along their original creases, pressed each line flat with the bone handle of a curling knife, and returned them to the envelope. The eastern walnut stood beyond the back door, rooted where broken pavement gave way to a strip of black soil. Willa circled it slowly, 7 feet above the ground, beneath a shelf of peeling bark. Rust outlined a narrow iron feather. Its quill had been driven deep into the trunk, and the tree had grown around its edges without swallowing it. She touched the cold metal with 2 fingers. A shallow notch marked the bark below it, no larger than a thumbnail. Willa did not pry at the tree. Beatrice had asked only that the marker remain. For the first time since finding the money, Willa obeyed an instruction without needing to understand what waited behind it. Inside, she chose the small brass spirit lamp from the heirloom tools. Its wick had hardened, so she trimmed away the blackened end, filled the reservoir with fresh oil, and turned the wheel until 1 clean thread emerged. The flame rose blue at its base and gold above, steady enough to illuminate the platinum feather inside the formula book. The room no longer seemed occupied only by the dead. Willa remembered the Port Authority driver who had let her stay aboard until the last stop because sleet covered the sidewalks. She remembered Ada James in the Newark church basement, who had pushed a folded blanket toward her with 1 bare foot. Mrs. Harrow had placed Elias's archive number beneath the deed instead of returning the card to its drawer. Theo had held the warehouse ladder without asking whether Willa deserved the building. Solomon Grady had opened a credit ledger when she possessed no credit at all. None of them had rescued her. Each had simply moved 1 obstruction aside. Before this story goes farther, think of 1 small kindness someone once gave you when they had no reason to. A meal, a dry place, a ride, a name remembered at the right moment. Tell us about that person in the comments, because quiet help often survives longer than the giver ever knows. That night, Willa wrapped the curling knives in clean cotton and arranged them beside the formula book. The Purple Heart remained closed in its case. She placed Beatrice's letter beneath her folded coat, close enough to reach in the dark, and slept with 4 generations of tools beside her. The first snow arrived on December 2nd, measuring 4.5 inches on the flat lid of the Indigo Vat. Willa read the roofing chapter of Solomon's repair manual 3 times, once beside the stove, once beneath the damaged rafters, and once aloud while marking measurements on the back of a flour sack. The shed roof ran 50 feet by 24 along the slope. Allowing 10% for cuts and breakage, she calculated 26 squares of felt, roughly 2,150 cedar shingles, and 38 pounds of hot-dipped nails. The numbers were larger than her credit and smaller than the winter. Solomon studied her list, then reached beneath a shelf and brought out a roofing hatchet with a square pole and a handle darkened by use. "My brother carried this 30 years, he said. He won't need it back." A retired roofer named Amos Pike arrived the next morning in a brown cap, shiny at the brim. His right knee did not bend fully, and he climbed the ladder sideways. When Willa asked his rate, he pressed 2 fingers against the nearest rafter and said, "You can pay me by listening." They worked 11 days. Where one rafter had split near the chimney, Amos showed her how to bolt a sister rafter alongside it, bearing from plate to ridge rather than merely covering the break. They snapped a chalk line across the felt, so each course would remain honest. Amos drove every nail with 3 strokes, 1 to set, 1 to seat, 1 to finish. On the 4th morning he pointed with the hatchet. "That nail's proud." Willa reached for the hammer. "Pull it." She did. By December 15th, the final ridge shingles overlapped against the northwest wind. Willa stood in the court while snowmelt ran into the gutter instead of through the sorting room. Amos descended without looking back at the roof, which was how she knew he trusted it. January exposed what the first fire had concealed. Several chimney bricks had spalled through their outer faces, and mortar beneath the roofline powdered beneath Willa's thumb. When she removed one loose joint, an entire corner shifted by 1/8 of an inch. Amos would not touch masonry, but Solomon found an old bricklayer's booklet and sold her 2 bags of hydraulic lime at cost. Willa mixed 3 parts screened sand to 1 part lime for the exterior joints. Around the firebox, she used 2 parts fire clay, 1 part hydraulic lime, and 3 parts sharp sand, adding water until the mortar held a thumbprint without slumping. For 3 weeks, temperatures remained in the 20s. She warmed only enough mortar for 40 minutes of work and kept the bricks beneath damp burlap near the stove. Outside, her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes because gloves dulled the pressure needed to pack narrow joints. She would stop, press her fingers against the warm kettle, then return before the mortar skinned over. She replaced 11 damaged bricks, rebuilt the top 3 courses, and shaped a sloped crown that sent water away from the flue. Each evening she brushed loose lime from the joints with a dry whisk broom and checked the chimney against a plumb line, weighted with one of Beatrice's brass scale measures. On January 28th, she lit a test fire of newspaper, pine, and 2 dry walnut splits. Smoke tightened into the throat and rose without hesitation. Outside, it left the chimney in a straight gray ribbon. Willa watched until the last trace disappeared above the warehouses. The front room floor was white pine, though decades of dye, soot, and boot grease had disguised it. Its planks were wide and irregular, fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails, whose dark heads sat like small seeds in the grain. Willa reset each proud nail with a punch before renting a random orbit sander from Solomon for $14 per day. He made her promise not to linger at the ends of the boards. "Machines remember hesitation," he said. She made 3 passes. 80 grit removed the blackened surface and old wax. 120 softened the scratches. 220 raised a pale, clean grain she had never expected beneath the room's darkness. Along the walls and beneath the sorting table, she worked by hand so the machine would not flatten the irregular edges. After vacuuming twice, she wiped the boards with mineral spirits and laid down the first coat of penetrating oil with folded cotton. The second coat drank more slowly. The third remained on the surface long enough to be rubbed thin before dusk. She blocked both doors and allowed a 48-hour cure. The color shifted as the oil settled, moving from dark honey toward mahogany, where old dye had entered deepest. Every rosehead nail became visible. One morning during the sanding, Willa reached the shed and could not lift the machine from its case. She carried her coat instead to a narrow marsh beside the Hudson freight cut, where runoff had collected behind reeds and broken stone. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, motionless except for the slow turn of its head. She remained there until afternoon and did no work that day. The next morning, she returned before sunrise, fitted the 120 grit disc, and continued from the exact board where she had stopped. There were 8 windows in the shed. 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked from corner to corner, and 1 retained an original pane dated by its wavering bubbles and thick lower edge to 1788, salvaged from an earlier building and reused when the shed was constructed. Willa left that pane untouched. She removed the other sashes one at a time, labeling each cord pocket and hinge with pencil. The old putty came away in dry scales after gentle warming. She cleaned the rabbets, brushed them with boiled linseed oil, and bedded each replacement pane in a thin ribbon of DAP 33 glazing compound. The first glazing point sat too deep. The second pane shifted when she turned the sash upright. By the third, her knife moved at a steady angle, drawing the putty into a clean bevel that sealed against the glass without showing from inside. The sash cords had rotted to brown threads. Willa replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each line over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot at the cast iron counterweight. She tested every sash before closing the weight pocket, listening for scrape, drag, or imbalance. The final window faced the eastern walnut. Willa had just smoothed the lower putty line when a chickadee landed on a branch beyond the glass. It leaned forward, black cap bright against the February sky, and tapped the bark once with its beak. Willa held the glazing knife still until the bird flew. Then she lowered the sash. It remained exactly where she placed it. The walls had been built with horsehair plaster pressed over hand-split oak lath. Most remained sound, but beside the chimney, 3 patches failed in succession. The first mixture dried too quickly and cracked around the edges. The second sagged because Willa laid it too thick. The third appeared firm until the stove warmed the wall, then released with a quiet slap and broke across the floor. Solomon brought her an old feed bag filled with coarse horsehair, saved from his brother's roofing years. Willa cut the fibers to thumb length and worked them into lime plaster until each handful pulled apart reluctantly. She dampened the oak lath, pressed on a scored scratch coat, and waited until it held the mark of her fingernail. The brown coat went on 3/8 of an inch thick and cured beneath wet cloth for 72 hours. The final coat measured 1/8 of an inch, drawn smooth with a steel trowel, whose corners she had rounded on a stone. When the wall dried, the new work remained slightly lighter than the old. These patches will hold another 100 years. She set it without pride, testing the surface with her palm. By March, people had begun leaving useful things without asking whether Willa required them. Doris Bell, who owned the Blue Thimble Cafe, wore red-framed glasses on a silver chain and carried paper bags folded twice at the top. She left them on the doorstep before opening her kitchen. Rye sandwiches, bruised apples, soup sealed in jars. When Willa followed her to the cafe with $2, Doris closed Willa's fingers around the coins. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Willa did not explain that there was no shop yet. Caleb Grady arrived on a blue Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, all elbows and serious concentration, with one shoelace replaced by electrical wire. Without introduction, he split the walnut rounds Theo had stacked near the chimney. Willa offered him 50 cents from the sale of a repaired sorting rack. He shook his head. My mother said, "About your grandfather." Then he returned to the wood, embarrassed by the sentence. Reverend Boyd walked through the service court each morning on his way to a mission kitchen. He had a white mustache trimmed straight across and carried no umbrella, even in rain. He never entered the shed. He tipped his hat toward Willa, paused beside the eastern walnut, and offered the same 4-word prayer. "Keep these hands steady." Willa answered by lifting whichever tool she held. She postponed the cellar until February 11th, when the ground had been frozen long enough to slow the seepage beneath the rear wall. The stair door resisted until she cleared hardened indigo from its lower edge. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot chamber with a fieldstone floor, low joists, and the mineral smell of standing earth. At the center lay a dressed granite slab, unlike the surrounding stones. A carved plume mark crossed its surface, one central shaft with 4 curling branches on either side. Willa swept the outline clean but did not lift it. The slab belonged to the building more completely than she did. Under the 3rd step, her fingers found a small oak box wedged behind mortar. Inside lay a brass key, its bow shaped like a curled ostrich feather, and a tintype wrapped in linen. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the Plume shed in the summer light of another century. She held a curling knife across both palms. Her hair was darker than Willa's, but the narrow chin, level eyes, and uneven left eyebrow were the same. On the reverse, written in faded ink, were the words Clara Mercer, daughter of founder Augusta Voss, age 25, summer of 1903. Willa sat on the granite step until the cellar chilled through her skirt. Elias had known the trade was connected to their family, but perhaps not how closely. Or perhaps he had known and waited for a time when the knowledge could be given without becoming a burden. She placed the key on the mantel above the stove. She did not know what it opened. Snow retreated into gray seams along the warehouse walls. The creek beneath the freight cut grew loud with runoff, and the eastern walnut loosened long green catkins above the repaired windows. Willa cleaned Beatrice's scale and copied the black formula onto fresh paper, but she did not begin the full craft that spring. The preserved plumes were too rare, and the old bath demanded knowledge she had not yet earned. She chose one worn French coin from the cache and exchanged it through a dealer for modest supplies: soap flakes, gall, madder, iron salts, and inexpensive domestic feathers. She practiced with small samples, no longer than her hand, recording every temperature and failure. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Willa completed her first true ostrich plume. She began at 6 in the morning with a cream-colored feather whose shaft bent slightly left. The soap bath held at 110 degrees for 12 minutes. She rinsed twice below 60, pressed out the water without twisting, and lowered the plume into a bath darkened with gall, madder, and cooled iron liquor. For 40 minutes, she kept the temperature between 145 and 150 degrees, adjusting the flame by fractions. When the feather had nearly dried, she laid its spine across her palm and drew Beatrice's blunt knife beneath each flue. The branches curled slowly, not into perfection, but into balance. By evening, the plume was black, with a quiet blue luster, darker at the heart and soft at the edges. Willa placed it upright in a glass jar and watched it move whenever the stove drew air through the room. The restored interior held no unnecessary brightness. The pine floor carried its old dye shadows beneath 3 coats of oil. 8 repaired windows admitted winter light. Curling knives rested above the sorting table. The brass thermometer hung beside the vats, and one wall remained patched in 3 visible shades of lime. The building had not been made new. It had been made usable. That winter, a storm split a dead branch from the eastern walnut. When Willa cleared the fallen wood, she saw that the iron feather marker had loosened from the growing bark. Behind it lay a small brass plate set flush into the trunk, green at the corners and shaped like the end of a narrow lock. The key from the cellar entered without force. A section of old bark and metal opened upon a cedar-lined hollow, created before the tree had closed around it. Inside rested a folded 48-star American flag, wrapped in waxed cloth, and a note dated December 19, 1944. Ruth Voss had written it after learning that Samuel would not return from France. She asked that the flag remain near the workroom where he had repaired vats, sharpened knives, and planted the walnut from a seed carried in his pocket. He was not a man who spoke greatly, the note said. He repaired what stood before him. Let this cloth belong to the next person willing to do the same. Willa refolded the flag along its established lines. She did not display it in the shop. She placed it in a shallow walnut case, above the mantel, protected from sunlight, with Ruth's note beneath it. On August 25, 2025, the anniversary of the liberation of Paris, Willa carried Samuel's Purple Heart to Cypress Hills National Cemetery in Brooklyn. A records clerk helped her locate his memorial entry among soldiers whose remains had never been returned. She laid no flowers. She set one properly curled black plume beneath the stone for the length of a prayer, then carried it home before rain began. Of the cash, Willa used 4 coins. 1 paid for roofing materials. 1 purchased the chimney brick and lime. 1 covered glass, sash cord, and winter fuel. The 4th bought dyes, feathers, and a small second-hand stove fitted with a safer flue collar. The remaining coins went back into the tin dispatch box. She added Beatrice's letter, copies of every repair receipt, and a page bearing the words, "For the next one." Then she returned the box to the dry chamber beneath the indigo vat and seated the cedar disc above it. She did not conceal the chamber as completely as Beatrice had. 1 cedar plug remained slightly proud, enough for careful fingers to notice. The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris pinned an index card to the Blue Thimble Cafe corkboard, hand-dressed plumes, repairs, morning hats. The old Voss shed. The first customer brought a crushed feather from her grandmother's wedding hat. The second mailed 2 plumes from Albany. By spring, the handwritten mailing list held more than 40 names, though Willa accepted only the work she could complete without hurry. She charged for hours, materials, and postage. Nothing more. Doris received 6 beeswax candles in glass jars, each wick trimmed exactly level. Caleb returned one October afternoon, taller and quieter, carrying a sign wrapped in a moving blanket. He had carved it from walnut taken from the branch that exposed Samuel's hidden plate. The lettering read, Voss and Mercer Plume. Dyeing and dressing in daughters Willa, traced the final words. "There are no daughters," she said. Caleb's uneven shoelaces had been replaced by work boots, but he still looked down when speaking. "Not yet," he said. She considered removing the words. Instead, they mounted the sign above the double doors, using brass screws and lead washers so rain could not enter the grain. The phrase did not promise children. It left room for apprentices, nieces, strangers, or anyone whose hands arrived later and were willing to learn. That winter, Willa began a letter of her own. She used black ink and heavy cream paper, writing at the sorting table, while snow gathered along the service court. She described the roof pitch, the lime ratios, the preserved pane of 1788 glass, and the chimney joint that required inspection after every second winter. She recorded the location of the shutoff valve and warned that the floorboard beside the northern vat still bent during damp weather. Then she turned to a new page. "My dear one, whoever you are." She did not explain Marin, the debt papers, or the cardboard box outside the bakery. Those belonged to another kind of record. Instead, she wrote that a person might enter the shed with very little and still have something useful to offer: attention, care, and the willingness to repeat a task until the material answered honestly. She wrote that inheritance was not ownership. It was maintenance performed for someone not yet present. Brightness was not something one was born with. It was earned by steeping in the darkest water and keeping the color. Near midnight, Willa folded the unfinished letter and placed it in the drawer beneath Beatrice's formula book. Outside, snow rested on the walnut branches and softened the roofs of the garment district. A late truck moved along 38th Street. The repaired window glass trembled once, then became still. The historic ostrich-plume dyer's shed waits. It has always waited. In the county clerk's office, Mrs. Evelyn Harrow kept the original auction envelope in the back of her desk drawer. The coins had entered the city account, but the single worn dollar bill had caught beneath the brass stamp that morning. She had flattened it, written, "Willa Mercer," $9 deed across one margin, and left it there among the records that should not be forgotten.